For our Shepherd's bookshelf today, we're looking at a very interesting book called Abuse, Abandonment, and Divorce. It's by Steven Schultz. He's a pastor in California. It says, confronting the reality of marital abuse with foundational issues, biblical compassion, and exegetical objectivity. So this is a book that's weighing in on a big issue today that has to do with the not only the issue of divorce and remarriage, but what allows for divorce and remarriage. And so Schultz wants to look into this, and he says this, I'll quote him, he says, adultery should be considered a cause for divorce primarily, and in parentheses, I dare say only, when the adultery is unrepentant. And abandonment should no longer be defined purely as one spouse physically leaving another. Abandonment may also occur while living under the same roof, defined using a modern word, abuse. So we're starting to look here at some very important subject concerning what abandonment means. And this is a very hot topic right now in conservative evangelical circles, within biblical counseling circles. Is divorce allowed for abuse as well as abandonment? So Schultz goes through this very carefully. He hits a lot of rabbit trails in this book. So here's some of the subjects he touches on. First of all, what is biblical marriage? He defines it this way as a one flesh relationship between a man and a woman that is exclusive for a lifetime, created in the sight of God and in front of witnesses. He calls this the covenantal view of marriage and supports it with several evidences. He also says there's 11 major views on divorce and remarriage. And then he goes after the top three, ultimately coming out with the idea that I think many of us have and many in our circle have, and that is that divorce is sometimes allowed, and when it is, remarriage is also permitted. But Swartz goes after and believes in the two exceptions for divorce, two reasons given in Scripture for divorce, which would be, of course, adultery, as he's already mentioned, and abandonment. But he believes that a large section, an important topic, has been left out, and what he calls a category, an entire category left out, and that is, what do we do with abuse? That is, these people who are living under the same roof, nobody has left anybody physically, but the spouse, normally the man, is violent, physically violent with his mate, or, and this gets a little more tricky, emotionally abusive to his mate. Is divorce and remarriage allowable for that kind of abuse? This is really what he's after in the book. So he believes that most people accept the traditional view, those that are in this camp, accept the traditional view of abandonment being an unbeliever, leaving a believer physically. And so there's a separation. And he believes that that is what he would call Christian mythology, which is the idea that something has been repeated so often within Christianity that everyone believes is true, even though he doesn't believe that can be supported totally by Scripture. So stay with me. He's not done with that yet. He does examine Scripture carefully. He wants to look at different important passages. For example, Malachi chapter 2, verse 16, where usually is often translated that God hates divorce. Swartz does a great deal of work on this to show that's not the best translation. I'm not sure if he wins his case or not, but he goes after that quite heavily and says, even God at times, such as in Ezra chapter 10, actually demanded divorce in that circumstance. You can go back and look at that when the Jews had married women who worshiped idols. And he also says God himself is divorced. He's divorced Israel. I think he needs a little more work on that particular subject. That divorce language is used in the Old Testament, but obviously the Lord is still connected with Israel, and Israel is his bride, so to speak, throughout to the very end. God has not abandoned Israel, so not sure what kind of divorce we're talking about here, but that's really not germane for the main point of his subjects here. He does show that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in particular, divorce in the first century was not was not really different than leaving your spouse, especially in the pagan world, the Gentile world, at Corinth and so forth. If someone would leave their spouse, it was the equivalent of divorce. Now the Jews, we go back to the Old Testament, chapter 24 of Deuteronomy, and Jesus' follow-up on that in Matthew 19 and so forth. The Jews had to have a writ of divorcement, an official divorce document. But the Gentiles didn't do that in the first century. If they left, that was considered divorce. And so in 1 Corinthians 7, the separation was divorce, not simply physically removing your body from a house and so forth. He does recognize, however, his view can open a door to what he would call cheap divorces, where people look at their marriage and they're not happy, they're uncomfortable, they're disappointed, they're whatever. And so they have chosen, based upon Schultz's work, that they can go ahead and divorce their spouse without very much of a cause at all. They just don't get along. He's concerned about that, and rightly so. It'd be very easy to slip down that slope. And so he spends some time trying to show what would be a cheap divorce, what is not abandonment, not abuse. And I appreciated that he did that. And but he does say divorce is not the unredeemable evil. It's not the unpardonable sin. And he believes that church leaders, such as pastors and elders and deacons, who have been divorced and remarried, can be leaders in the local church. A lot of those in the conservative evangelical circles would not necessarily agree with that. All this is kind of leads up to this is a kind of backdrop to lead up to the major theme of his book. So the major theme of his book is that abuse constitutes a form of abandonment. And this would be a biblical criteria. That's the second step. This is a biblical criteria for divorce. And if it's a biblical criteria for divorce, it's also a biblical criteria for remarriage. So this is what he's after here. And so he's going to try to prove that abuse constitutes a form of abandonment. And that the abuser can remain under the same roof and still commit abandonment. So this is a harder sell, and he's looking at two different things. First of all, I've already mentioned physical abuse or violence. Virtually everybody agrees that if a spouse is being physically harmed, or children are being physically harmed, that the spouse must do what they have to do to protect themselves and to protect their children. And to move out under those circumstances, to separate under those circumstances is perfectly allowable. I know very few people who would disagree with that under the right circumstances. But he is saying here more than that. He is saying that that abuse is a form of abandonment. Physical abuse allows the spouse to divorce their spouse, the abuser, because of physical violence, and then they'd be allowed to remarry, even if the abuser is more than happy to stay in the marriage and stay under the same roof. The trickier part here is this, that alone is questionable, but the trickier part is the emotional abuse. And this is where a lot of people will have to do a lot of thinking on this particular subject. What is emotional abuse to the level of abandonment, to the level of allowing someone to divorce their spouse because they've been emotionally abused? Well, what constitutes that kind of emotional abuse? So he makes a number of suggestions: social isolation, financial abuse, verbal reviling, get to that one in a moment, threats, direct or subtle, put downs, criticisms, cursings, yelling, ridiculing, humiliation, being treated like a servant or a slave, sexual abuse, including using sex as a bartering tool. Now he knows this is going to easily be manipulated, so he tries to give some guardrails here, some safety nets, so that people don't go off the rails here. And he says this emotional abuse is not the same thing as being uncomfortable, not the same thing as your expectations aren't being met, not the same thing as your spouse being too self-centered or greedy. These are things that happen. As a matter of fact, in almost any marriage, If you're not careful, if you look at emotional abuse as any of the things I just mentioned, if you're not careful, you could at any given time throughout your marriage say, this is it, I'm going to leave, I'm going to divorce, and I have biblical legitimacy to do so. He wants to safeguard that. He wants to be very careful with that, and rightly so. But he builds a lot of his biblical case on his exegesis of the word revile. He spends a number of pages, 147 to 155, looking at the Hebrew and Greek words that are translated revile. And he ultimately concludes that reviling would be virtually synonymous with our modern term of abuse. And if the spouse is a reviler, then they've committed an emotional abuse, even if they haven't committed a physical abuse. And therefore, there is an allowance for a divorce and an allowance also for remarriage. So this is a big deal and something to really consider. He talks a lot about the only person who has the right to determine whether or not true abuse has taken place is the individual. That nobody lives with them, nobody can be a fly on the wall. The church cannot determine objectively whether or not abuse has taken place. The individual must choose that themselves. But that brings in a great tension because he does believe in discipline, church discipline, and at times the church has to step in to do that. And yet, if the church does not weigh in on whether or not a person has been abused, we've got this tension between the individual and the church. That is not resolved in this book. I'm not sure it really is resolvable, but it is definitely a concern and a tension. He also talks a lot about psychological trauma using issues such as that most abusers do so because of power and because of control. They want to control. And that may be a definite reason for abuse, but I don't think it's the only one. I find that a little too close to psychological language for my blood. But I think there's other reasons as well. There's lust, there's self-centeredness, there's anger, there's the background of childhood upraising and how they were brought up in that particular home that could lay in there as well. But the final part of the book is actually the heart of the book. Ultimately, he lays out 4 lines of evidence that abuse may be a form of abandonment that allows for divorce and remarriage. Number 1 is biblical linguistics. We've already talked about that with the word revile and some other things. Secondly, what he calls constructive desertion. This is when an unbeliever demonstrates an ongoing contempt for the believing spouse. So he calls that constructive desertion. Third is historical. He goes to the past and looks at some very prominent Christian leaders who seem to take the same view he does. He knows that's a relatively weak argument, but it is an argument. And then finally, soteriological. He says that he tries to prove that a reviler is an abuser, and a habitual reviler would have to be an unbeliever and therefore meets the criteria of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 of an unbeliever who has separated from or abandoned their believing spouse. What makes his view different is he's pretty sure this reviler is an unbeliever. That's a little hard to prove always. And secondly, that this is a situation where the reviler is actually in a situation where they have abandoned their spouse because of the way they have treated them and spoken to them. So that's soteriological. If we follow 1 Corinthians 7, it has to be an unbeliever that leaves a believing spouse, and he believes an unbeliever is one who is a habitual reviler or abuser. So that's kind of the line of his argument. So the bottom line is this: divorce and remarriage is permitted when marriage oneness has been broken at an unrecoverable level. Unrecoverable level. I think this is an important book. It comes into the debate on this subject, which is very hot right now. A lot of people are looking into this, talking about it, debating it, and this book, I think, is one well worth deserving our attention. I'm not sure I can buy all of his argument. I think his argument on reviling is a little weak for my taste. I think it's very hard to prove what emotional abuse is, especially to that kind of a level where you say the marriage is unrecoverable. That's very subjective, very individualistic, very hard to go there. So that's a true problem, I think, for Schultz, as well as anybody trying to work with this subject. But I appreciate the tone. He's very compassionate. He's very concerned. He's trying to be very biblical in his position. Not all of us would agree with his conclusions. I think I come up short on his conclusion. I surely had to think this through a lot more before I could buy emotional abuse exactly as he sees it. But it definitely is a book worth looking into, because this is a subject that's not going to go away. The church is going to have to deal with this. Christians are going to have to deal with this. So looking at material that weighs in and tries its best to be very biblical is very good, even if you don't agree with it. So throw that out for you. Abuse, Abandonment, and Divorce by Steven Schultz.